Meg Hillier.
Thank you very much, Mr Turner, and a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my honourable friend for securing this debate on what is a vitally important issue. There's been much talk in the media and in reports by people like Alan Milburn, and I know the government is taking seriously the work on social mobility. Yet, if we don't deal with this issue about differential attainment because simply of the colour of your skin or your ethnic background, we will be letting down generations still of young people. And we have had a mixed story to tell, I think, in recent years. And I applaud the work of my honourable friend, the member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, for her pioneering work on this. Had she not been making noises about the underachievement of black boys in particular, I don't think some of the progress that we've been made and some of the changes at bureaucratic level would have taken place. And I'm going to touch on that in my recommendations or suggestions to the Minister at the end. But I think if we look back over the last week, we've seen, of course, the Secretary of State make some comments about GCSEs and suggestion that we split that exam. And I do want to touch on that first. That's very topical and I think very relevant to many of my constituents in Hackney. I share his concern. In fact, I would agree with the Secretary of State that we want to see rigour in standards. So on that, we certainly don't disagree. And in Hackney, we have seen huge improvements in schools, which were achieving well below the national average as little as 10 years ago or even 7 years ago, and are now achieving most schools well above, with Mossbourne Academy, which my honourable friend cited, achieving 84% 5A to Cs, including maths and English, plus a number of children going on to not just good universities, but Oxbridge, as well as other Russell Group universities. So we've done a lot in Hackney to improve standards, and I think we put that down to good heads with rigorous standards, a very clear framework of expectations for young people of all backgrounds, and no excuses because of poverty or ethnicity. No low expectations. One school, City Academy, which is headed by the principal, Mark Emerson, who now also is acting executive principal of City Academy Islington because of the success he's achieved so far. Though that school has not sat GCSEs, he has told his staff that they should see all the pupils in his highly mixed, ethnically mixed school, which is populated mostly from the dense local council housing estates in the area. He should see all those pupils as future A-star pupils. But that's the expectation the teachers must have of the pupils. And in doing that, in 2 years, it's in its third year of pupils now, it's a school that's been growing year by year. Most of the pupils are a couple of terms ahead of the expected achievement at the end of their second year, at the end of year 8 in secondary school. And in fact, a couple of the pupils are over a year ahead of where they would normally be. And these were not pupils who came in necessarily with the highest level of achievement with Key Stage 2 with level 5s. Some of them were achieving under that. And he's got them not just back to where they should be, but actually above that. And I think that's an indication, and I picked one school, but there are very good examples I could pick. I could spend a lot of time talking about good practice in Hackney schools. I'm sure it's not all perfect, but we've seen really good practice. So good heads, good rigour. And the fact that we've actually seen huge investment, thanks to the last government, in new schools, in good buildings, where young people feel, they've been amazed when they've gone into their new schools, that this is something I deserve. So there's a sense that they have the right to be in a good quality environment. And the schools, of course, operate very long days with breakfast provision, after-school provision. Another school, Petchy Academy, in my constituency, does, for example, same-day detentions, but seen as a positive, so that if a child is falling behind for whatever reason, they could have been messing around in class, they could just not understand something, they could have difficulty at home, which meant that they've got other issues that they're bringing into the classroom. At the very end of the day, they spend an hour focusing on that area of underachievement, so that by the next day, the very next day at school, they're back with the rest of the class. Now, it doesn't always work, I'm sure, but that as an aspiration surely has to be something that we need to see. And of course, many pupils in Hackney come from quite challenging homes where they are often living in overcrowded conditions, often with families with long periods of worklessness. And I'm going to touch on some of the issues around particularly ethnicity and language in a moment. But just to go back to what the Secretary of State was saying, I do not agree with him that introducing or reintroducing a two-tier system for education is the answer. The idea that Hackney pupils at really 11, or certainly by the time they're 13 or 14, would be pigeonholed and earmarked, 25% of them for a lower qualification, is a retrograde step. The example I've just given about City Academy Hackney it shows that there is a lot that can be done at secondary school for pupils who haven't perhaps achieved their full potential at primary school. And the idea that we would have a cohort of teachers expecting that a percentage of pupils would go in for a lower exam grade, I think, is a retrograde step. The benefit of the GCSE is that whatever your ability, you can progress on the same programme of attainment, and if you do work hard, you can achieve above the C grade. So I think also changing the landscape massively confuses matters for employers who tell me that they've got a number of issues about the qualifications young people come out with, but I certainly don't think changing it will make a difference. And Mr. Turner, I'm not alone in thinking this. I quote Lord Baker, of course, who was former Secretary of State for Education, who I think gives good advice to the Minister and to the Secretary of State when he says the CSE certificate, which we did away with in the 80s, and I was one of the last pupils to sit the old GCE, became a value, and I'm, so it tells you perhaps a bit when I won't admit my age, but when that took place, so we're talking over 20 years ago, became a valueless bit of paper. It wasn't worth anything to the students or to the employers. That means that there has got to be rigour for the other subjects at 16 as well. And he is promoting, as I am, the university technical colleges, of which we've got one in my constituency, Hackney University Technical College, where young people will be studying from 14 and doing more technical qualifications alongside their academic qualifications, but not seen as a second best and not seen as something different and not seen as instead of GCSEs, but as well as. Mr. Turner, I'm one of the vice chairs of the all-party group on social mobility, and I think that in that discussion, as I've touched on, there's much talk about universities, but actually, and getting young people into university. Of course, it starts much earlier, which is one of the reasons I was a great champion of Sure Start. The investment in young children at the under 5 stage and in their parents, in helping them parent better and understand the benefits of wider education through play at that stage is very important. And you talk to professionals and they say they can see the difference between a parent who's been to Sure Start and has been supported that way and those that haven't, and because of the way that there's a positive engagement with the child. So I think we've got to start there. We also need to see a raising of attainment at primary schools and a raising of ambition, which is why many Hackney primary schools take young pupils off to universities and into the workplace through work programmes to see for themselves. And this is particularly important for a range of young people, including some from ethnic minority backgrounds, who don't have a pattern of work in their family. But I want to touch on some of the actual data, why this issue is so important and why the Minister, I'm sure, is listening very hard, but really does need to make sure that the department is not taking its eye off this ball of inequality because it is still quite stark. So although we've seen some improvements in Hackney, provisional data from 2011, so last year's results, shows that there was a 6% gap in achievement at GCSE level between Caribbean heritage boys and all other boys, and a 5% gap between the same cohort of Caribbean girls and all other girls. And if you look at the pattern from 2005, due to a number of interventions by various schools and the Learning Trust in Hackney, we've seen achievement at 5A star to C GCSEs, including Maths and English, and steadily improving for both boys and girls. So it's a good story so far, but that gap is not something that we should sit back and say is acceptable. I certainly give way to my honourable friend.
I'm going with honourable friend. As a Hackney resident and a Hackney mother, I'm glad to see, the very many improvements. But we need to be careful about what we say about improvements, because some of the stats go back to a period where there was the use of NVQ equivalents to GCSE. And my concern is that some black children, although on paper the gap may have narrowed, it's because they've been palmed off with this notion of NVQ equivalents, which do not, in fact, equip these children to compete in the marketplace.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I think the statistics can bury many, many issues, which is why I think the point made by my honourable friend for Oldham about, which I'll touch on at the end, about ensuring that there is proper teacher training and support so that assumptions aren't built in at the beginning, I think is a very key one. And I'm going to touch on a couple of examples of where I've seen that in the past. But one of the issues that doesn't figure probably on most honourable members' horizons, but my honourable friend from Hackney North and Stoke Newton and I will see this very regularly, is the issues around Turkish, Kurdish and Cypriot children who are still massively underachieving compared with their cohort group. So, although there's been an improvement since 2011, we still see a gap in attainment between Turkish, Kurdish and Cypriot boys and girls and all other pupils of 14%. And this brings in one of the other issues around language. Many of these young people will speak at home, will only speak their mother tongue, which is fine. Mother tongue is very, very important, and of course parents and mothers in particular are the first educator of a child. But where the parent is perhaps not very literate or in mother tongue, that means they're not necessarily getting the range of educational input from parents in mother tongue. And then the only adults often a lot of these young people speak to in English is their teacher. So their exposure to the wider world is sometimes a bit limited, because often the family business can be working with other Turkish families, for instance, often run by the family, often helping in the family business, and then the mosque and other community groups where mother tongue is spoken entirely. And I think it's very, very important, and I don't want anyone to go away with the impression that I don't think mother tongue is important, because mother tongue is, I think, very, very important, and actually very important for our young people as they go out into the world and develop their careers. I think that's a real, given that the Turkish economy, for example, is growing at around 7% a year, I think. That is a real skill strength for young people in Hackney. But it is an issue. And it is an issue that may not hit the radar screen of the Minister, because they're a relatively proportionate to the whole of the national population. This is a relatively small and focused group, particularly in parts of North East London. So, but if we look at the difference between overall, and again, I take my honourable friend's point about statistics, but if we look at the difference between when young people leave primary school at 11 and when they get to GCSE level, in Hackney in 2011, we saw 77% of white boys leaving school at Key Stage 2, at the end of Year 6, with a level 4 in English and Maths. And at GCSE level, in the same year, so it's not the same cohort, but this shows what we've got to, the gap we've got to bridge. 51.7% got 5 or more A-star to C GCSEs, including English and Maths. That's a differential of 26 points. And if you look at the same figures for black boys, 69% achieved level 4 in 2011, and then not the same cohort again, but the same year, 42% achieved 5 A-star to C GCSEs, the differential of 27 points. The differential is actually very similar, but there are, I think, endemic issues which I've touched on and others have about why certain groups achieve less well. And I just want to give an example to illustrate why I think my honourable friend's point about teacher training is very important. For about 9 years, I was a governor and latterly chair of governors at a primary school in North Islington. And it was a time when there was a period of that time, there was a very big shortage in teacher recruitment. So we had a lot of very bright, talented young teachers coming keen to teach in a school, but many of them, to put it bluntly, had never seen a black face in their life. And they came in, and the head teacher, who was a black woman, and that was still quite unusual, and I were very concerned on a couple of occasions. One, when a child was very scared about going into an assembly to see African dancing. And I said, my immediate reaction was, that's terrible that a child is worried about seeing something that reflects, to a degree, their own heritage. And there are a number of issues to unpack there about witchcraft, about pride in their background, and so on. But the other teachers just saw this as naughty behaviour because they just hadn't come across the cultural issues involved. And another example is when they were casting for The Wizard of Oz, where, of course, Dorothy is in the film, Judy Garland, therefore a young white girl. So this was the image, presumably, in the minds of many of the teachers. Each class was asked to do a bit of The Wizard of Oz. So they each had a witch, they each had a Dorothy, and so on. And the Dorothys, when they came back from the class teachers, were all little white girls. So, of course, the head, being, from a different background, challenged this. But it really, at the time, made me worried that this was a cohort of good teachers, actually, but teachers who didn't have that perspective. And I think that is a real worry. So what we also need to see is some of our young people in schools now, not just achieving well, but going on themselves to become teachers. And I just should touch on City Year Kids, which which I have been actually with the Children's Minister, the member for... not Brighton, sorry, Shoreham. The honourable member for Shoreham and I were actually at a school, Seabright School in my constituency, is one of those that has City Year come in. And they're young people doing a gap year, working with pupils, and they provide mentoring, physical training, and an extra adult, really, around to provide support to the young people. And they found different ways of engaging. And we're very popular with the Hackney schools that have them in, now moving into secondary schools. But what is also good about that cohort is, generally speaking, those groups of young people who are aged between around 18 and 22 coming into Hackney schools reflect better the wider Hackney community. They're not all from Hackney, but they reflect better what you might see, if I put it simply, on a Hackney bus. Whereas, of course, because of, well, not of course, but there's a degree of time lag with teacher training, that the teachers in our schools do not necessarily reflect the ethnic background of the pupils that they're teaching. And I do want to ask the Minister what the department is doing to try and encourage, and actually just, let's be honest, we don't have enough teachers from ethnic minority backgrounds. Is there any proactive action that the government is taking? Because just as we have concerns about not enough male teachers at primary school because of the role model issue, I think this is a real issue that the government needs to not be shy of addressing. And that brings me to my final point in terms of recommending things to the Minister. We used to see a breakdown of achievement by ethnic background in a quite detailed way. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member of Hackney North and Stoke Newton. I think if she hadn't been talking about it and making it acceptable to talk about the difference between black and white children, we wouldn't have seen the courage of the department at the time to break down much more granularly by very different ethnic groups. Now, we see we've gone back to broad brush breakdown, so black, white, Asian and so on. That doesn't break down for me. For example, that wouldn't pick up Kurdish, Turkish and Cypriot achievement, which is a very big issue. So while we collect some of that locally, there is no data set collected. And I know there's been a nervousness about pigeonholing pupils by ethnic background, about labelling. But actually, used properly, that information can be very, very helpful. It can be used by members of parliament and parents and others to challenge what a school is doing. It can be used as a tool by good head teachers and teachers to make sure that they're focusing on areas where there is proven underachievement and that they're making sure that they are not contributing to that. So I would ask the Minister to comment. If he can't comment now, because I understand it is perhaps a detailed point for him, but perhaps he could write to me with exact reasons why the department no longer breaks down to that level of granularity, and if the department would consider doing that again. And if he could also pick up the point about teacher training and attracting more pupils from more young people from ethnic minorities to go into teacher training. Thank you.